Welcome everybody to today's episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am delighted to be here with Lily Silverton. Lily is a journalist and a well-being and mindset coach, and she is also soon to be mummy of two. So welcome, Lily. It's so good to have you here.
Thanks, Tara. It's wonderful for being here. Thanks for asking me.
You're so welcome. And Lily also has a podcast as well. So I was just saying to her, it must be quite nice to be the one being interviewed today as opposed to the interviewer. I have a newfound respect for all journalists, podcasters after doing this. So Lily, my first question that I like to ask is, what is your definition of grief? Because it's so interesting to hear, different perspectives on this.
So, I guess my definition of grief is that sort of black and white, yin yang opposite thing where you can't have deep feelings of love without also having the opposite of that, which is at some point things will shift and change. And that's sort of the grief and the loss side. So it's such a natural, normal experience response to loving deeply in whatever way, and whether that's the love for a person, whether it's love for an identity of your own, whether it's love for a circumstance, we form these huge attachments as human beings, and when they change, when they shift, as everything is changing and shifting, then we experience that loss, and that's what that grief is. So it's an emotional reminder that our world, whether on a big sort of macro level or a very small micro level, has shifted and changed.
Thank you for that. And I was curious, because you are a journalist, but what led you to doing the wellness part of your job?
So I have practiced yoga and meditation to some extent, but more yoga when I was younger for about 25 years now, so since my early teens. And it was always a huge part of my life. And I became a journalist in my early 20s and worked in fashion and arts for magazines in-house. And then sort of steadily into my late 20s, decided that it was time to do my yoga training, having practiced it for so long. And once I'd done that, I found that more and more I wanted my life to be in line and aligned with those sorts of practices. So I moved my journalism more towards mental health and well-being and sort of how we cope with the world and our responses to it, and began to teach. And it was through the sort of more mindfulness practices of some of the trainings that I did that I discovered this side of coaching, which is the well-being and mindset coaching, and specifically working with things like stress and anxiety and burnout. And when I studied it, I started off in a very casual way and was just completely blown away by the lessons that were there in terms of the thought patterns in our minds and how we, it's there a lot in yoga. So you do quite a bit of that. And I was very interested in that side. So when I did the trainings in coaching, it was a very natural pathway, I guess, for me. And I had really bad mental health when I was younger. It was terrible. I was very unwell for a long time with depression and eating disorders. So I knew firsthand, as many people who go into this kind of work do, the negative impact of my mind and my thoughts. And once I saw both firsthand and in people I worked with the transformative effect of this quite simple stuff, I was just quite hooked, I guess.
Yeah, so it's always so interesting to learn about people's pathways to doing what they're doing. And I guess in a similar sense, we've sort of got a bit of a parallel that, from fashion to wellness. And it seems like more and more people are moving in this direction. And during the pandemic, obviously, we have, all been having our own mental health struggles, and you wrote the brilliant article about grief during the pandemic. And I was just thinking, how do you think the pandemic has shifted our awareness of grief?
It's a great question. Thank you for the compliment on the article. I'm glad you enjoyed it. So I wrote an article on processing grief. I wrote it at the beginning of this year, about last year and how much things had changed. And I guess my overwhelming reason for writing it was there are, of course, these huge, big griefs in life, which, I've experienced, which you've experienced, which many people have, losing a job or losing a loved one. But there's also much smaller griefs that happen on a day-to-day basis. And that seemed to be a lot of what typified the pandemic for many people, that feeling of loss. And for some people, they did lose people and they did lose jobs. However, for a lot of people, their life kind of technically on the surface continued as usual. However, so much had changed and so much had shifted that they were experiencing loss in very small ways on a daily basis. And I think before that, maybe most people wouldn't have thought of grief in terms of small losses of identity or of social connections, or, of your daily routine, even a loss of, your morning coffee that you love to get on the way to the office because that's your thing, or the podcast you listen to on your commute, or whatever it is. Those spaces and time that we carve out for ourselves throughout our days and that we get used to with our routines were all obliterated. And I think people came to understand loss and grief in a different way, that they could be affected in these smaller micro ways, but which could also add up to something quite big. As you say, for a lot of people, I think for most people at some point, it's been a challenging year. And they were also more ambiguous losses. So I think people came to understand this idea of ambiguous grief, where there is no clear end. Obviously, if you lose someone, if someone dies, that it's a difficult, but it's a clear end. Losses that we experienced, which are smaller, there's no clear end, there's no definition. They're quite ambiguous, and I'm sure you know very well through your work, it means they're actually quite hard to process and work through because you never quite know where you stand with them. So I think those are a lot of the lessons that we learned about our relationship with our mental health and with loss and grief.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that people, have never sort of thought about it before, relating those things to grief. And I was thinking about your work that you do with anxiety and stress and burnout as well, because as you were saying, people missing the coffee or the croissant on the way to work, or also having the connection that work, meetings, going to lunch with people, and actually, I mean, I'm very great. Like, I actually really love working on Zoom, and I find that it's really efficient and it's quite nice not to get in the car or have to travel somewhere. But at the same time, the burnout is different because people are like going from one to the next with no breaks in between in this past year, and getting real Zoom fatigue and burnout. Is that something you've been talking to clients about?
Yeah, loads. It's come up so much, especially for some of the more corporate organizations that I would work with pre-pandemic and continue to, where their staff, you and I, the work we do, we don't have to be on Zoom all day, or whatever it is, GChat, or these programs all day. We dip in and out of it alongside the work that we do offline. But for a lot of people, they've really spent the past year plus now on constant meetings online, and while they can be great, they're also very hard to read facial expressions. It's a little bit harder to read a room, especially if there's a large group of you, if it's not just two of you chatting. So it's definitely been that experience. And as you say, there's not those little spaces that were important to people before, where they would release from their stress, that they would use to release their stress, whatever it was, whether it was, enjoying their lunch or however they operated with their day. Those were taken away, and so the monotony as well can burn people out. It's not just sort of stress of screens, it's also the monotony and lack of joy for a lot of people. For most of us, I think that was, something that was lacking the last year or so.
Absolutely. And especially if you're living alone, especially that, because you don't have the social interaction just within the home life. So much grief in that, and so much loneliness in this past year. We don't realize sometimes, how social connection can really just give us a lot, and we need to receive that.
Yeah, absolutely. And how much without those you have to dig so deep into your own inner resources. Tiring in and of itself as well. I heard a lot of people saying they were just tired of sort of building themselves back up all the time. They wanted some external stuff that could help. They didn't want to have to do the whole, mental resilience and rebuilding the whole time.
Absolutely. I know, because in one sense you're like, it's been a really great time to go inwards and have more reflection and get closer to our emotional world and feelings, but at some point you're like, oh, this is boring, come on. And we talked about your dad, which I'm so sorry that he's going through this illness at the moment. And how has it been for you in terms of like anticipatory grief?
So my father has stage 4 brain cancer, glioblastoma, and it's not curable. So they can treat it and hopefully prolong things a little bit, but it's not a curable one. And he was diagnosed 6 months ago, so really in the midst of everything as well. And one of the things that's really so I've experienced quite serious grief before. One of my very good friends took her own life when I was 18, and then another very good friend was shot later that year. So 2 very sudden and violent instances of loss and grief. But in this case, it's been quite drawn out. Initially, we weren't sure how things were going to go. It looked very immediate, but as time's gone on, and with brain cancer, he's changed a little bit as well. There is this feeling of knowing that something is happening and is going to happen, and anticipating it the whole time. So your system, your body goes into this state, your nervous system, where you are a little bit aware of that, along with everything else that you're aware of in your day-to-day stuff. And I hadn't really known that much about, I'd written about grief years ago, but I hadn't known that much of anticipatory grief myself. I hadn't had that lived experience. And I found it very exhausting. And I hear from people that actually often the grief after passing, after a death, can be a little bit easier, because again, it's more finite. With this type of grief, you are never quite sure what you're grieving or how long you should be grieving for, and it can influence, like anything, your day-to-day life and your interactions, where you're trying to get on with life, because also that person is still there and you're still seeing them, and that's wonderful, and you've got that time. But it's that knowing that that time is probably limited, which, as we all know, we could all be hit by a bus tomorrow. So it's not that it's not that we don't acknowledge that, but I guess it's just having that very felt, both emotional, mental, physical, spiritual knowledge that someone that you love very much and that's very important to you, that their time is quite limited and your time with them is limited.
Yeah, and like you were saying, just seeing the changes, in their physical form, in their mental form, spiritual form, and that those are the small griefs that are happening as well at the same time when somebody has a cancer. So, and it's so tiring, so exhausting, and all the hospital appointments and trying to understand the diagnosis and the processes, and it's a lot, especially at the same time as being pregnant too, which is also tiring.
It happened the same week. So we found out I was pregnant with this one. And then a few days later, my father had seizures when he was with us and was blue lighted into the hospital. So it's been the two have also been, it's been quite interesting as I grow this life inside me. My father's growing a different kind of thing inside him.
Yeah.
In quite a strange time in that respect as well.
And I was thinking about the deaths that you had in when you were 18. And did you find that you really went to your yoga practice at that time? Did that help support you in those moments of grief?
No, I didn't. I was quite young. I guess I did to some extent, because not long after, like a month or two, well, yeah, after my friend took her life, another friend of mine and we went to India. It was our gap year. So we'd already planned it and we were in a friendship group, all of us. So we missed her funeral and we did our own like little one when we were out there instead. I don't feel like I used the tools that I had. I don't feel like I felt empowered to.
Mm-hmm.
And also, this was 20 years ago almost. And there wasn't the language around these practices that there was now. I just did yoga and I did it above a pub, and I loved it. And I knew that it was very important to me, but I didn't see it as a modality for healing, which I do now, as a way to sort of go inward and be with and process some of those emotions. It was just something I loved doing. So I think probably if that happened now, there'd be a lot more language around, what can I do? How can we support you in moving through this? But back then,
yeah, so true. Yeah, it was very different. And actually being 18 as well, we are more sort of like, let's keep going with what we're doing. And yeah, but it must have been like obviously a tremendous shock for you and your friendship group.
Yeah, it was. I think we only really understood that a couple of years later as well. I think it's a bit of time to understand the ripples of that.
Yeah. Yes. And when you are working with clients, for example, do you use all your different modalities with them, or do you find like one that you prefer to draw on?
Yeah, I think it depends on the client. I always push meditation. It's the main one that I will encourage as much as possible. Especially people who haven't tried it before, sort of a short daily practice of something that I think can be so transformative. That scientifically we know can be so transformative. It changes the brain. You do a little bit every day. So I always try and encourage them especially when I'm working one-on-one, to have a practice of that, because that tends to feed into everything else. If we are as people, spending that time, giving ourselves a little break from the incessant chatter of the mind, then we can start to realize the thoughts that aren't helping us, connect with them more easily. And that's sort of the whole premise of all the mindset coaching, is how can we change the thoughts that we have in our minds? How can we be really honest about our emotions and embrace them, but also not let them take over? And all of that grounding is within mindfulness and meditation. Breath work as well, for a lot of people who can't quite connect with meditation initially, is a great point in, I find, because it's something that they can do. Likewise with yoga, or some sort of physical practice, depending on ability. And
Yeah.
Physical ability, not in terms of like how good you are at yoga, just physical capacity. So yeah, meditation or breath work, and then sort of from that, a lot of the coaching can get in much easier, I guess.
Yeah, because I was thinking a lot of the time, for some people, talking about it isn't always the best thing. And that's why having sort of like a combination of modalities is really helpful, because the grief can come up and come out maybe while you're just moving on a yoga mat or doing breath work. Because a lot of the time we want to sort of, well, like we use humor to sort of talk over things, or we just don't really want to start crying. So we're very good at talking around things. And I think that yoga and meditation or breath work can really help people access their grief in a different way that talking doesn't always.
Yeah, absolutely. I think any good therapist as well, if you are in a period of grief, will encourage you towards some sort of body practice, because grief is so physical. We hold so much of it, even if we don't realize that our bodies and minds are so connected, and our bodies respond so strongly to grief, even just on a physiological level. We have the sort of nervous system and the response of that. And then there's also a lot of literature, a lot of held beliefs around the idea that we store grief in our body as well, that it gets trapped in various bits. Actually, the traditional Chinese medicine thinks it's in the lungs. Mm-hmm. And you know that feeling, that heaviness in the chest of grief. So that does make a lot of sense to me personally as well. So looking at practices where you can start to free that up a little bit. Mm-hmm. As you say, it can enable people to access maybe emotions or responses that they may have ignored. Mm-hmm. We've all had that experience, right, of doing something physical and then suddenly this past grief comes up that you're like, whoa, where the fuck did that come? I'm allowed to swear, right?
Yes, it's fine.
Where did that come from? These little bits of all of our experiences that we hold in our body. Have you read The Body Keeps the Score?
Yes, and I was going to ask you, have you got any books that you would like to talk about? Yeah.
I absolutely love that one. It's formed a lot of the way in which I work, which I treat. I think the Bessel van der Kolk, I think is the author's name. And actually there was quite a lot of controversy around him generally a couple of years ago. However, the book remains a very, very good book. I think, and essentially talks about, he works a lot with PTSD, and about trauma and how we store it in the body, and how various practices can help shift that in a way that talking can't necessarily, because as you say, we have so many defenses, and often we're not really aware as well because of all those defenses that we've put up.
I know, I'm so fascinated by, you know, how the body stores trauma. And I think particularly because I always felt my mum didn't process her grief, and then she got breast cancer, and there was probably so much sort of held inside of her. So yeah, I'm always intrigued by how we can move that energy and release it, instead of allowing it to get stored up inside us and become toxic. And now there is, like you said, there's just so much more awareness than there's ever been before. And it's so brilliant, because people are really like, it's just talking a lot more openly about everything, I think, even in the last maybe 6 to 10 years. And that just allows when other people talk about it on social media, it gives other people permission to say, gosh, I feel like that. Maybe I would never have had the courage to express it, or maybe I would never have articulated it, or they didn't sort of realize until they've seen somebody else talk about it. And I think that's why actually one of the really powerful things about social media, and for some people obviously it's not relevant, but I think it really can help bridge a lot of gaps.
Absolutely. And there's so much out there now with people sharing their accounts of loss, forming support communities around that. nice to see the good side of social media, isn't it?
It is. It is. Exactly. It truly is.
Value that it can add, which, you know, is definitely there.
It can, because I think also, blogs were some sort of ancient things now, but that was sort of the first gateway of people just putting personal writing out there,
Yeah.
and people could see the benefits of reading. And some, maybe also it's easier to read something than to even be part of a group and talk about it, because again, it's sort of personal to that person who's reading it and finding it helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and my final question was to ask you, what do you think is the definition of, or your interpretation of, conscious grief?
I found this really interesting. I was having a good think about it. I guess for me, it goes back to the principles that I've learned through yoga and meditation and those various mind-body practices, the introspective practices, which is really about allowing yourself to feel, experience, embrace, accept your grief, your loss, and being very honest about that without any expectation or judgment or assumption about what that should look like or how that should be processed. Because also, I mean, as you say, we can release grief, and it can change and shift, but then it can also come up in new ways that we don't expect. 10, 20 years later, life is always shifting and changing. So there's never a point at which you're like, oh, okay, I'm over this now. Or, I completely let go of that, because they'll, big life experiences will always affect you in some way. And that's a really important thing to acknowledge and embrace as well, because it makes you the person that you are. So how can you integrate difficult experiences like grief, painful, traumatic experiences, and integrate them into yourself so that you can use them to move you forward with, rather than hold you back? So I think for me, that's that conscious grief, whether it's, and it goes back to that initial definition of sort of, joy and sorrow being the same bedfellows.
Yeah, thank you for that interpretation, Lily. That's very profound. Yeah, I love it.
That
And,
my mind.
and you are very generously giving anyone who's watching a free gift. So perhaps you'd like to talk about it, because you'll explain it better than I will.
Yeah, absolutely. So I work quite a bit within the realms of stress and anxiety, and helping people with sort of more low levels of that stuff, humming levels of that stuff, and support themselves through moving through periods of difficulty. So I have a free toolkit for those with stress and anxiety and uncertainty. And that includes a couple of my most recommended tools and techniques and tips to help people weather slightly more challenging times in their lives.
Well, thank you for that. And we will have a link below this video. And also, just to say again about Lily's podcast Priorities, it's also something to check out, because you have loads of great guests on your podcast, and really it's about what people put at the top of their priorities, isn't it?
Yeah, what's important to them, and how things shift throughout life, how our priorities change and shift depending on what happens, which of course grief comes up fairly often within that as well for people, because it can be a big catalyst for change.
Yeah, 100%, and definitely shift our priorities.
Yeah.
Get a little clearer on what's important. Oh, Lily, thank you so much for being here. And yes, I'll be thinking of your dad and your family at this time. So I hope I will keep in touch and see how you're doing.
Lovely to connect with you, Tara. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. And to everybody at home, thank you very much for watching.